Hello everyone, it's me Uncle John. Today I am going to read S1 3170 Curious George Goes to the Hospital by Margaret and H.A. Ray. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. Today, George was curious about the big box on the man's desk. What could be in it? George could not resist. He simply had to open it. It was full of funny little pieces of all sorts of shapes and all sorts of colors. George took one out. It looked like a piece of candy. Maybe it was candy. Maybe he could eat it. George put the piece in his mouth, and before he knew, he had swallowed it. A while later, the man with the yellow hat came on. "Why, George," he said, "I see you have already opened the box with the jigsaw puzzle. It was supposed to be a surprise for you. Well, let's go to work on it." Finally, the puzzle was finished. Well, almost finished. One piece was missing. The man looked for it everywhere, but he could not find it. "That's strange," he said. "It's a brand new puzzle. Well, it cannot be helped. Maybe we'll find it in the morning. Let's go to bed now, George." The next morning, George did not feel well. He had a tummy ache and did not want to eat his breakfast. The man was worried. He went to the telephone and called Dr. Baker. "I'll be over as soon as I can," said the doctor. First, Dr. Baker looked down George's throat and felt his tummy. Then he took out his stethoscope and listened. "I'm not sure what's wrong," he said. "You better take George to the hospital and have an x-ray taken. I'll call them and let them know you are coming." "Don't worry, George," said the man when they were driving to the hospital. "You've been there before, when you broke your leg. Remember how nice the doctors and nurses were?" George held his big rubber ball tight as they walked up the hospital steps. A nurse took them down a long hallway to a room where she gave George something to drink that looked white and tasted sweet. "It is called barium," the nurse explained. "It helps the doctors find out what's wrong with you, George." In the next room stood a big table, and a doctor was just putting on a heavy apron. Then he gave the man one just like it. George was curious. Would he get one too? No, he did not. "You get on that table, George," the doctor said. "I'm going to take some x-ray pictures of your insides." He pushed the button and there was a funny noise. "There, now you may get up and we'll have the x-rays developed right away." "Now let's see. Oh, there's something there that shouldn't be," said the doctor when they were looking at the x-rays. "Why, that looks like, I think that must be the piece that was missing in our jigsaw puzzle yesterday," said the man. Well, said the doctor. "At least we know now what is wrong with our little patient. I'll tell Dr. Baker right away. George will have to stay at the hospital for a few days. They'll put a tube down his throat to get the piece out. It's only a small operation. I'll call a nurse and have her take you to the admitting office." Many people were waiting outside the office. George had to wait too. "Look, Betsy," the woman next to him said to her little girl. "There's Curious George." Betsy looked up for a moment, but she did not even smile. Betsy had never been to a hospital before. She was scared. Finally, it was George's turn. A pretty young nurse took him to the next room. My, how many rooms and how many nurses there were. One nurse wrote down a lot of things about George, his name and his address and what was wrong with him. Another nurse put a bracelet around his wrist. "It has your name on it, George," she said, "so that everybody knows who you are." Then the pretty young nurse came back. "My name is Carol," she said. "I am going to take you to your room now. We call it the children's ward, and put you to bed. There will be lots of children to keep you company." And so it was. There were a lot of children in the room. Some were up and around. Others were in their beds, with the doctor or the nurse looking after them. Dave was having a blood transfusion. Steve had his leg bandaged and was just sitting in a go-kart. Betsy was in bed, looking sad. George got the bed next to Betsy. George was glad when he was in his bed at last. His tummy was hurting again. The man sat with him for a while. Now I have to leave you, George. He finally said, I'll be back first thing in the morning before they take you to the operating room. Nurse Carol will tuck you in when it's time to sleep. Then he left. George just sat there and cried. As he had promised, the man was back early next morning. The nurses were keeping George very busy. One nurse was taking his temperature. One was taking his blood pressure. One was giving a pill to make you sleepy, George, she said, and one was getting ready to give him a shot. It's going to hurt, George, she said, but only for a moment. She took his arm, and George let out a scream. But the needle hasn't touched you yet, said the nurse, laughing. There, now it's done. That wasn't so bad, was it? No, it really was not, and anyway, it was over now. By the time the attendant came with the stretcher to wheel him to the operating room, George was getting sleepy. He tried hard to stay awake. He was curious to see what would happen next. He could see a big table with bright lamps over it and doctors and nurses all around. They had caps on their heads and masks over their faces. Only their eyes were showing. One of the doctors winked at George and patted his head. It was Dr. Baker, who had been to the house when it all had started. He looked funny with his mask on, and then George was fast asleep. When George woke up, he did not know what had happened. He did not even know where he was. Then he saw Nurse Carol. It's all done, George, she said. They got the piece out. In a day or two, you will be running around again. The man had brought him a picture book, but George felt sick and dizzy. His jaw was hurting, too. He was not even curious about the new book. He closed his eyes again. Well, let him sleep, said Nurse Carol. The more he slept, the better. The next morning, George felt better. He even ate a dish of ice cream. Dr. Baker came to see him, and the man, of course, came too. Betsy was watching him from time to time. She seemed a little less sad, but she still did not smile. Steve wheeled his go-kart over to George's bed. Tomorrow I can get up and try to walk, he said. Boy, I can hardly wait. Part A.